Reimagining Mental Health Services for American Indian Communities, Centering Indigenous Perspectives, co-sponsored by AADL and the University of Michigan Department of Psychology.
Tonight, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Joe Gahn present some of his exciting and thoughtful work. So Joe is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Department of American Culture. He's also the Director of Native American Studies, all of those here at the University of Michigan. Joe received his undergraduate degree from Harvard with a concentration in psychology, and then he went on to receive a PhD in clinical and community psychology from the University of Illinois. Joe examines cultural influences in mental health, as well as the intersection of evidence-based practice and cultural competence in mental health services. A citizen of Gros Ventre tribal nation of Montana, Joe has investigated these issues through collaborative research partnerships in both reservation and urban American Indian communities. Joe's talk is entitled Imagining Mental Health Services for American Indian Communities, Centering Indigenous Perspectives. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Gahn.
It's really a pleasure to come out and have a chance to share some thoughts with you tonight, and I applaud your coming out in a gloomy, rainy January evening, which you can't say that often in Michigan, I don't think. I am going to talk to you about mental health services for American Indian communities, and I really have 4 different phases in this talk that I'll go through. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about me. So I'm an academic psychologist. When most people hear about psychologists, they think of people doing therapy with someone on a couch, right? And I've been trained to do therapy, so I am clinically trained, but the work that I do is primarily through engaging community members in partnerships around trying to produce therapeutic outcomes for people who are suffering in some way. And all of that work, because it's really engaged with American Indian communities, tends to be culturally attuned in what I do. My research interests, very broadly construed, are at the intersection of culture and mental health. And because I work with American Indian communities, I'm interested in indigenous facets of psychology or indigenous psychologies that can depart in some ways from what we think of as familiar psychology in Middle America. And specifically because of the interest in mental health services, I'm interested in cross-cultural interventions or cross-cultural treatments, approaches that might benefit American Indian people who are going through difficult times in their lives that look kind of different than therapy in general. So with that background, I really have 4 goals for us tonight. And the first is to define for you what I call a post-colonial predicament that vexes mental health services for American Indian communities. The second is to consider various community-based approaches that harness culture as treatment for resolving this predicament. Then I want to assess the strengths and limitations of these diverse approaches relative to issues of cultural commensurability. Finally, I want to grapple with challenges facing these kinds of projects in the era of professional accountability and evidence-based practice in mental health services. So let's start with the post-colonial predicament. Post-colonial simply means after colonization. And American Indian people have been peoples for whom the United States and immigrants from Europe early on came, settled, conquered, and put Native people on reservations and so on. That's what we refer to as colonization. But that era is shifted now, and so the era is after colonization. That's why I'm talking about the post-colonial predicament. Let's start with thinking about American Indian mental health inequities or disparities. One thing that's clear from all of the research and probably everything you ever read about American Indian communities in terms of their mental health status is that we are subject to pronounced mental health problems of various sorts in our communities. In addition to this, there are services that are on offer in our communities that are meant to remedy these kinds of problems are woefully underfunded. For example, the U.S. Indian Health Service, which is responsible for taking care of the health needs of Indian people, is funded at maybe 40 cents on the dollar in comparison with the health care resources that are available to other Americans. So we might simply assume that if we have inequities, an epidemic of certain kinds of problems in some communities, and underfunded services, maybe the simple solution is we need to expand services, provide more funding, get more professionals, get more treatments and clinicians engaged in this activity, right? Well, the story I want to tell you tonight is one in which I came to think that that may not be the only answer. It started really back when I was first doing research as a psychologist. I went home to my own reservation in Montana, the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. My goal, this was shortly after getting my doctorate, was to explore culture, drinking, and depression among the tribes that live on my reservation, the Gros Ventres and the Assiniboine people. And the idea was not to try to understand these from the perspective of psychiatry or psychology, but really to start by trying to understand them from the way local people talked about these issues: culture, drinking, and depression. And especially to try to listen for what anthropologists sometimes refer to as an explanatory model. That is, the concepts that everyday people carry in their minds about how these things might be linked together and the way they come to understand them. So during my investigation on my home reservation, I talked to a lot of people, and one particular individual stands out for purposes tonight. He chose to be identified in our research together by his Indian name, which was Traveling Thunder. And so I talked to him about culture, drinking, and depression, and I want to share with you some of the things he taught me. So Traveling Thunder had an explanatory model for the problems of depression and drinking and on the Fort Belknap Reservation. And the way he talked about them was that he broke down history into 4 different periods as he was explaining where these problems come from and why they are a problem today. The first era he referred to was the era I labeled Paradise. It's the era, according to him, of pre-colonial existence, when Indian people lived free and how they wanted to live prior to incursions by white people and settlement and reservation life and so on. And according to Traveling Thunder, this pre-colonial existence was one of perfect harmony and balance, owing to strict observation of custom. Well, the second era he then talked about was one in which the colonial encounter occurred and conquest was the result. And conquest, according to Traveling Thunder, really resulted in the annihilation of indigenous custom. So there was a pre-colonial existence that depended on custom, and there was the decimation of that custom through the colonial encounter. And this led to a third era, one of loss, in which there were clear post-colonial effects, including depression and drinking and those sorts of things. According to Traveling Thunder, it was really anomie that he pointed to as leading to these forms of disorder or pathology. Anomie is a term that means no name, so it means loss of identity, loss of purpose, not understanding who you are, where you belong, and what you're supposed to do. In addition, he identified the white man system, as he described it, as the pathogen, as the problem, the origin of the problem when it comes to mental health issues during this era of loss. Finally, and somewhat hopefully, he identified a fourth era, the era of the present day, he said, an era of revitalization in which there was a post-colonial remedy for some of these problems. And that remedy was especially concerned with returning to indigenous and especially sacred custom. So you've got the idea that there was a harmonious life based on custom. There was the colonial encounter that destroyed the custom. The after effects of that loss of custom was loss of purpose and identity and all kinds of what we think of as today's mental health problems. And then the solution is to go back to that custom in some way, shape, or form, and that is what can heal Native people. So for Traveling Thunder, in this particular interview that I'm telling you about, there was a really clearly identified pathological process, a sequence of things that happen that would lead to problems. He started with cultural repression. This is the idea of the white man system, forcing Indian people not to live their old way of life, but trying to take on a new way of life. And it's that cultural repression that led to anomie, or loss of name, identity, purpose, and so on, that in turn would lead to substance abuse. Substance abuse would spiral you down into a depression in which you would feel worthless and ultimately perhaps commit suicide. And in case you're not familiar, American Indian people have some of the high rates, especially of youth suicide in the world. And so he's laid out in this interview this clear connection and this clear sequence of events to account for where depression and problem drinking come from. Interestingly, he offered very little elaboration in all of our discussions of personal distress. This person went through this, or I've experienced that. Actually, he offered a relatively non-biological or non-psychological account at all. He didn't talk about genes, he didn't talk about brain chemistry, he didn't talk about our early childhood problems in an individual's life. Instead, as you heard, he emphasized history, culture, and spirituality. Moreover, as I told you, he attributed these disruptions in community life to the white man system. That is, he identified colonization as the cause of native distress. He emphasized in doing so systemic factors over intrapersonal factors. This is about a system that has overwhelmed our lives as opposed to individual stuff going on. And it resulted in, of course, shared community vulnerabilities. It's not about this person, that person, the other. It's about all of us on the reservation. Now, you can compare this with a pretty recent discourse in Indian country known as historical trauma. This is the primary way that people today would talk about these kinds of things. But interestingly, Traveling Thunder did not mention the word trauma. And I think that's significant because in some ways our conversation predated the dissemination of the term and the concept of trauma widely in society. In other words, trauma is a psychological concept. It's about your emotional response. And as I said, Traveling Thunder was pretty apsychological. He didn't have a lot to say about emotional states and feeling states, thinking states, and so on. Well, in all of this, of course, I wondered, well, what is the relevance then of stock mental health services, the kinds of psychosocial interventions that are available even in our reservation community through the Indian Health Service? So I asked him, well, under what conditions would you take a loved one of yours with whom you were worried about down to the Indian Health Service and have them see a clinician there? Well, he got quiet for a minute. And in response, he said the following: I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. If you look at the big picture, look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future, where the white man's leading you, I guess you could make a choice. Where do I want to end up? I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it would be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrist in the Indian Health Service and say, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that would be a choice each individual will have to make. I probably don't have to add that Traveling Thunder was not interested in making that choice, and he was not interested in taking his loved ones, this hypothetical loved one I mentioned, down to the Indian Health Service. But what's interesting here is he pointed out really that mental health treatment, first and foremost, is a cross-cultural encounter, that mental health treatment is not the one-size-fit-all that mental health professionals typically think of, that it involves some kind of different or divide that he's pointing to in this instance. Not only that, it's not just that there's cultural differences, he's saying there's ideological functions in mental health services, that he's pointing out that mental health services can be seen as a form of implicit Western cultural proselytization. Proselytization means missionary work. So that mental health services themselves are involved in ideological transformations of Native people in ways that they might not be on board with or maybe not always be aware of. So this leads me to want to define then what I mean by the post-colonial predicament. On the one hand, we have quite urgent community mental health needs. Many Indian people live in impoverished, high-risk settings, and there are well-documented disparities or inequities in mental health status, particularly around trauma and its aftermath, addictions, suicide, and so on. On the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer are often said to be incongruent. You get this from Traveling Thunder's observation that they involve brainwashing me forever so I can be like a white man, and it's attested to by community anecdote and by research evidence. So community anecdote, everywhere you go in Indian country, people will tell you our culture is our treatment. We need to go back to our own traditions, and that's what will therapeutically benefit us, as opposed to bringing in services that were developed somewhere else. In terms of research evidence, some of the very best epidemiology in Indian country has shown that Indian people are as likely or more likely to consult healers for mental health problems than mental health professionals. And indeed, in a Great Lakes study with a lot of families, adults were asked to rate in order the people they would want to consult when they're going through a crisis of some kind. And something like the top 10 or top dozen had nothing to do with medical and behavioral health care. Mental health professionals didn't make the list till like number 12. So there's lots of people folks would be interested in seeing, but it wouldn't necessarily include that. Instead, they preferred informal, traditional services of some sort or another. All right, so let's talk about an integrative approach. So in terms of revisiting this post-colonial predicament, the need but the wrong kind of services, we need to recognize first and foremost that clinical intervention is cultural prescription, right? That there's nothing you can offer in terms of a service or a treatment for mental health that doesn't also have embedded within it all kinds of cultural assumptions and cultural orientations that may or may not fit the person's life with whom you're working. And with Indian people in particular who occupy this post-colonial status, we have to acknowledge the hazards of a kind of neo-colonial cultural proselytization, this kind of missionary work that involves transformations of people that they may not sign on for or be that aware of. So it led me to want to consider seriously this indigenous claim I already mentioned when people in the community will say, our culture is our treatment. What might that mean, and where might that take us? Well, one thing it means is that people are pointing to therapeutic alternatives that are based on reclaimed traditional practices. So the sacred customs that were decimated, that Traveling Thunder says now we can go back to, this is the kind of thing that Indian people have in mind when they say our culture is our treatment. And those kinds of practices tend to involve holistic rationales that are grounded primarily in spiritual and religious experience. In other words, those customs are sacred customs. They're ceremonial customs. When Traveling Thunder laid out what he would do, that's the kind of thing he talked about, putting up a ceremony, calling on the grandfather spirits. And interestingly, these alternatives are addressed to personal distress. Of course, they need to be therapeutically beneficial, but not only to personal distress, they also address issues of cultural identity. That is, they remedy anomie, the loss of purpose and identity and so on. And they also serve interests in community renewal and self-determination. They're about charting our own path forward, finding our own way to solve our own problems that don't rely on outsiders and expert knowledge that may or may not be pertinent or relevant to our communities. With this background in mind, let me tell you about a second project I undertook in a Canadian First Nation healing lodge. So there's a picture of the lodge here. It was on a reserve in Manitoba. And this was a Western Algonquian band of Cree people who lived on this reserve. And this healing lodge was interesting because it was accountable to the band or the tribe. Bands are what they're called in Canada. It was tribally staffed. Every single of the 20-some people who worked there were themselves Cree. Most of them, maybe only 3, were not even from that reserve, but were still part of that ethnic group. And interestingly, for Canada, it was nationally accredited. So there are other kinds of these sorts of programs throughout Canada, but not all of them are, few of them, in fact, were accredited, but this is one that was by the national body that does such things. I focused on the outpatient substance abuse component because that was serving members of the community. They had an inpatient which served members from all over Western Canada, and they had a referral service, but again, I focused on where they were trying to reach out to community members on that reserve for purposes of substance abuse treatment. And what was interesting about this particular program was it had an avowed commitment to integrating Western and Aboriginal therapeutic practices. So it was designed to integrate. It was meant to try to bring 2 different sets of approaches together. So I approached it with a few different research questions. First, what does therapeutic practice look like in this setting? So to offer a description, what is it they're doing? What do they mean when they say integration, and what does it look like? Second, what does healing mean in this therapeutic context? So to elucidate from the things I could observe, the things people would tell me, the meaning of healing as they used this term. And finally, to assess what are the prospects and pitfalls of therapeutic integration of this sort in such settings. So what are the implications of what I learn about this from beyond, that would extend beyond this particular setting? My research strategy was quasi-ethnographic. An anthropologist would laugh at only spending 7 weeks, but for psychologists, that's not bad. And I conducted a lot of semi-structured interviews with all the staff and some of the administrators and some of the board members, and also then transcribed all those interviews, also observed and participated in a lot of things, and engaged in a form of data analysis called thematic content analysis. So let's start with the first question. How would we describe what therapeutic practice looked like in this setting? Well, the staff and the clients that I talked to, first of all, had a category, a classification called Western approaches. And in this category of Western approaches that they used in this outpatient program, first and foremost was the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, people talked about this as the foundation, it's the core of what we do, and it's really important because not only is it time-tested and proven to help people with addiction problems, but it's spiritual. It involves belief in a higher power and so on. So the spiritual aspect of it was an important part of why it was so central. In addition to this, there were a whole bunch of other, what we might call complementary and alternative approaches to treatment that were of interest to people. I mean, really quite indiscriminate. I mean, Reiki, neurolinguistic programming, anything that had kind of this vague hint of spirituality, but that might even be New Age or from around the world. This is the only sweat lodge ceremony, for example, I ever participated in where someone stopped in the middle to give a lecture on the 7 sacred chakras. I mean, so people were interested in this global flow of ideas around alternative spirituality and healing, and this was what staff were interested in tapping into on behalf of clients. They were completely uninterested and basically did not incorporate any what we might think of as evidence-based treatments for substance abuse. In other words, there's a whole set of approaches, techniques that scientists have developed to research and see if they can help people with addictions. And there must be, 15 or 20 of these different kinds of approaches for various kinds of addictions. Not only did they not know about them, if they had known about them, I doubt they would have cared about them. That was not what they were interested in. Instead, it was this appeal of an encompassing and often kind of nebulous spirituality. So this they called Western approaches, even though it folded in a lot of stuff that seems fairly cosmopolitan and beyond the West, so to speak. Basically, it meant non-Aboriginal approaches, because the next classification they had was of Aboriginal approaches. These involved things like talking circles, smudging, which is burning sacred incense, sweat lodge ceremonies, pipe ceremonies, fasting camps, once a year seasonal thing where you take people out into the bush and they fast from food and water for days at a time, maybe get a vision. These were the kind of things they had built in or structured into their treatment program in various ways under this rubric of Aboriginal approaches. Importantly, these were institutionalized into the treatment program. So the sweat lodge was offered every Thursday afternoon at such and such a time. And there was a certain cultural authority, cultural counselor, whose job it was to superintend these kinds of cultural things, to run the sweat ceremony and so on. In addition, as is true in every Indian community you might go to today, there are contestations around these things as to whether it's really the true thing, whether it really harkens back, whether that person has the right to do it. There was nothing particularly unusual about that here. It's worth noting, though, because it means that not everyone just accepts this. I mean, there are people even in the program who wonder and worry to some degree if who's leading it is really the right leader, and so on. So we have Western approaches of the kind I described and Aboriginal approaches of the kind I've described. How on earth did those come together into any kind of coherent approach to helping people? Well, the answer was in the model they overtly adopted and promoted, which they referred to as the medicine wheel. Most of you have probably seen a medicine wheel or heard of the concept before. You can see it represented in the right hand of the slide here, in which you have a circle subdivided by 2 perpendicular lines to create 4 quadrants. And the medicine wheel for Indian people, or Aboriginal or Indigenous people, is said to represent both directional space and cyclical time. So directional space has to do with the 4 quadrants are typically associated with the 4 cardinal directions. As you can see here, you've got east, south, west, and north. And they're also understood, those 4 quadrants, those 4 directions can also be harnessed to a lot of other things of 4, like the 4 seasons of the year. And in fact, the 4 seasons of the year are how this ends up representing cyclical time. So you can enter from the east it's yellow, and you can trace the circumference of the circle all the way around and then exit again. And this would be a representation of the seasons of the year, for example, where you enter in the east with the yellow summer and then all the way around through 4 seasons and exit. Or interestingly, there are psychological aspects that I'll tell you about momentarily. Basically, the idea of the medicine wheel is that there are 4 components, but they're really part of a unitary whole. So 4 things that are in one. And the idea is to emphasize not only the 4, but the fact that they all come together through balance into a unified whole. And so as applied to human psychology, you've got, first of all, the medicine wheel as a model or a topography of the self. The 4 components of the self that the medicine wheel are said to represent are spirit, mind, body, and emotion. Or sometimes spirit, mind, body, and the social aspect of human beings. It varies depending on what community you go to. But here it was emotion. And so these are 4 components of human experience that you can attend to individually, but they come together into a unitary whole. If they're out of balance, that can lead to disharmony or disorder. Interesting also, the medicine wheel offers a representation of the lifespan. So as I talked about the seasons of the year, entering and exiting, similarly you have the 4 stages of a full human life: infancy, adolescence, adulthood, and old age. Entering in the east here with the dependency and helplessness of an infant, and going all the way around till the helplessness and dependence of a very old person before they exit this world. So this was the way in which any kind of practice could be put together, because it would be harnessed within this model or framework about attending to the 4 aspects of the self and trying to make sure there's balance, and using whatever resources, therapeutic resources you could harness to trying to ensure that you're well mentally, you're well spiritually, you're well in your body, and you're well emotionally. So that was the first question, describing what these services look like. So what does the meaning of healing mean then with regard or respect to this approach? Well, certainly people told me what they thought healing mean. I mean, I asked. And the things they said are, summarized by me include, you could say spiritual or existential transformations that linked imperfect selfhood to some higher purpose. And it also meant for people there a post-colonial reclamation of Aboriginal cultural identity. I mean, they were very much about cultural identity. That's why there's a medicine wheel, they said. They were very proud that the medicine wheel was their model, because it set them apart from substance abuse treatment services as usual, and it helped to impress upon clients the importance of turning to an Aboriginal frame of reference when pursuing therapeutic benefit. So these were the kinds of things they talked about when I asked, what does healing mean? But there were also an implicit set of meanings about healing that no one person said. In fact, no one really brought much attention to, but they're pretty obvious as you listen to this and try to work out what's going on. And there were really 3 components to these implicit meanings of healing: emotional burdens, cathartic expression, and self as project introspection. So, emotional burdens. Basically, the model of healing as practiced in this program was that people harbor unexpressed pain from the past that undermines present-day functioning. So they've been hurt or wounded or injured, usually in childhood, but throughout their lives, and because they've never acknowledged it or faced it or done anything about it, it impairs them today. Unexpressed emotional burdens. And so, part of the healing solution is some form of cathartic expression. That is, one can release this unexpressed pain through verbal expression of past ordeals, and that is what can restore one to wellness. This is why they have groups in which people talk about the things they're going through, because it's offering a therapeutic opportunity to express the pain from your past in a way that can help you. Third was this idea I've labeled self as project introspection. In other words, it requires a looking inward and taking on a management of one's interior self in almost an administrative or executive capacity. That basically therapeutic benefit required lifelong practices of self-examination, self-awareness, and working on oneself if you were going to maintain wellness. And really, this is what they meant when they referred to the healing journey. So the healing journey is the way people typically talked about this therapeutic benefit, and these are the components of it. So, in terms of being able to summarize the meaning of healing here, an ongoing process of positive self-transformation fueled by introspection, reflexivity, insight, disclosure, catharsis, dealing with one's problems, working on oneself, and finding one's purpose as an Aboriginal person. that ultimately reorients fragile and often damaged selves toward a more meaningful and compelling engagement in the world. I want to draw out buttressing Aboriginal identity. I mean, that's what set this apart from other kinds of programs that might have some of these same kinds of components. And also, it was interesting to see how they bridged the individual and the community. I told you before that it's one thing about personal distress, but then there's cultural identity and there's community self-determination that all are part of a larger project. And in this case, the staff spent a good deal of time, in fact, it was part of their mission, to go out into the community and do ceremonies to commemorate the abuses of residential schools, for example, in which Indigenous children were kind of removed from their families and assimilated in fairly blunt terms for a good part of the history of Canada. And, these schools were often loveless, lonely places where abuse was not infrequent. And so, having people try to have a ceremony in which they could begin to heal from the abuses of those schools was something this staff would do. Interestingly, people from the community could come in, and participate in the sweat lodge. They could come in and eat with clients and staff. So in contrast to your usual substance abuse treatment milieu, where it's confidential, where outsiders can't come, where no one, it's all clients only, the boundary here was really quite open. And I think that that's pretty remarkable to point out as well. So finally, I also asked, as part of a third question, what are the implications? What should we make of the prospects and pitfalls of this kind of integration for purposes of post-colonial remedy? Well, one thing that stands out to me is that this program involves a proliferation of what we might refer to as modern therapy culture. That stuff about emotional burdens and catharting through verbal expression and looking inward and taking on the self as a project should be perfectly recognizable to anyone who's ever been to the self-help section of your local bookstore. This stuff is it's sort of originates with Freud, but it's been worked and reworked in popular form in all kinds of ways to reach this point. I don't know if Freud would recognize it, but it's certainly Freudian, even though it's been reworked through pop psychoanalysis. Interesting, the staff were all eager and wedded to this project, in part because they had all experienced therapeutic benefit from doing this same kind of thing. So if you will, they were very enthusiastic because it had benefited them, and they were out to share it with other members of the community. But the pursuit of cultural commensurability was a little bit thwarted, I think, in this particular integrative effort, for two reasons. First, I think the communicative norms that endure in many Indian communities, but certainly in this one as well, that is, the expectations about who talks with whom and about what, under which conditions, were very different than the therapeutic ethos of self-expression. So everyone talked about talk. That was the most striking finding of my interviews. The clients talked about how the therapists were always trying to get them to talk, and oh my God, they didn't want to have to talk in these groups, and the last thing they want to do is to share this and share that. And the therapists all talked about it's like pulling a tooth to get these clients to talk. They won't talk, and that's because I think the communicative norms that govern everyday life in a face-to-face community where family reputation is how people's station and identity depend, sharing painful things from the past that implicate family members or that talk about things, that's going to get all around. There's no such thing as confidentiality when it comes to the moccasin grapevine. So there are ways in which it ran afoul, I think, of communicative norms. And because of that, there was real client reluctance to participate in the program and to follow through all the way to the end. I was told when I arrived there were hundreds of clients who had come into the program at one time or another. The records were lost, so I could never find out exactly how many completed all 12 weeks, but it might have been 24 at the most. So most people, even when they entered this program, did not find it to meet their needs and did not come back. And I think that again expresses or suggests that this integrative effort was doing something, but maybe still not able to reach the people they were trying to reach. So for me, this led me to want to consider what integration might look like. This starts with the core of sort of pop psychology and overlays it at the periphery with Aboriginal or Indigenous kinds of things, identity, ceremony, symbols, and so on. But what if we were to invert this? What if we were to exchange the core and the periphery, or the deep and the surface attributes, in an integrative effort like this to see what else might be possible? So, again, returning to this claim that you hear throughout Indian country, culture is treatment. let's think about centering indigenous therapy. And in doing so, I wanted to try go beyond the usual approach. So here's the usual approach. Start with a mainstream psychosocial or treatment approach, take it into a native community, and adapt it in some way to meet the diverse needs through community-based mental health. So take AA or take pop psychoanalysis, dress it in beads and feathers, and hope they go for it, right? That's the usual approach for how this is done. I was interested in, because of these earlier experiences, in thinking about an inversion of that approach. What would it look like instead to start with indigenous therapeutic traditions and then to secondarily cultivate these for use in community-based mental health services? How would we go deeply local at the beginning and then figure out what would follow from that? Now, to tell you about this, first need a bit of background to talk a bit about why culture as treatment might even be conceivable as a plausible way to help people. The context here is historical trauma, as I talked about before, has become the main way that indigenous communities talk about the colonial legacy as expressed through health problems, including mental health problems. And so historical trauma is what people often identify as the problem that we are in need of addressing. And I've been focusing on this in substance abuse services, and I'm going to continue to do that here as well. So it might take different form. Obviously, if you're talking about schizophrenia, that would be really different. But addiction might properly or most helpfully be described as a post-colonial pathology, and therefore amenable to an approach like culture as treatment. So the rationale for seriously considering the efficacy of culture and treatment is that first and foremost, in every community I've ever been to, lots of Native people will tell you that they had addiction problems, but they don't now. And the reason they don't now is because they've recovered from substance abuse due to participation in cultural practices. They started to go back to traditional ceremonies. They've started to fast. They've gone into the sweat lodge. They've learned how to do Indian religion, essentially, and that transformed their lives in such a way that they don't drink anymore. In fact, it's universally understood that substance use is incompatible with traditional ceremonial practice. Because of this, or perhaps in addition to this, scientific literature now has been able to link through correlations, statistical associations, that cultural practices are in fact related to American Indian recovery from these kinds of problems. And of course, I think all of us are familiar of someone whose life is going down the drain, but has this dramatic transformation. Often it's religious. So I think of people who are born again. They find Jesus or something, and they turn their lives around. And I don't think this is all that different necessarily from that kind of approach, in which the dramatic reorientation can yield transformations in persons relative to their purpose, motivation, spirituality, and social networks. So this is why I think it's worth at least considering that culture as treatment might be plausible as a way to address mental health problems. For this project, I approached administration and staff at the Crystal Creek Lodge, which is the substance abuse treatment program of the Blackfeet Nation, headquartered in Browning, Montana. And I began an initial dialogue with those staff in the spring of 2008, and I told them what I just told you. The usual way is to take an outside treatment and dress it up in beads and feathers. I'm interested in seeing if there's any community partners who want to start with traditional ways and figure out secondarily how to accommodate treatment settings with that. And in addition, I wondered to what degree we might be able to generate scientific evidence about the plausibility of these to help people. Because everywhere in Indian country you go, this is what people want, but there is no study, no evidence thus far that robustly accounts for the ability of these practices to actually be therapeutically beneficial in a rigorous scientific manner. Well, they were very excited about it. So we continued our deliberations. I went back through the summer of 2009, and basically all I did was try to facilitate a process. So with the cultural counselor there and some other people, we started to think, what would an alternative treatment look like for clients in this program that was centered on Blackfeet approaches? And it turns out that the cultural counselor was a member of a group of Blackfeet people who were interested in, as they said, revitalizing the old Blackfeet religion. And so the Blackfeet religion depends on a number of ceremonial bundle keepers that are opened at particular times of the year and that circulate power, that brings life, etc. And so they started to consult some of these bundle keepers about what they might do. Interestingly, the Crazy Dog Society, as they were called, was sort of a neo-traditional group of people, again, committed to this revitalization, who were willing to come on board and basically lead this effort to develop something that they thought would be beneficial based on Blackfeet approaches. The result was what I tend to refer to as a radically alternative treatment model, in quotes, because it doesn't look anything like treatment when it comes to addiction treatment that you might be familiar with. What they came up with was a summer cultural immersion camp. This camp would be like living like the ancestors, pre-reservation era. Go out into, some part of the outdoors, set up teepees, and try to learn as much as you can about how Blackfeet ancestors lived. This was entirely facilitated by the members of the Crazy Dog Society. That is, the treatment administration and staff supported it, but did not run it. In fact, it was understood they did not have the know-how to run it. Their expertise was different. It involved a deliberate socialization into the old Blackfeet religion. It was premised on ceremony. It was committed to the revitalization of those practices. And implicitly, no one ever said this now, but implicitly, the foundation of the ceremonial or religious approach is that healing and recovery from spiritual practices often comes because those practices circulate life. In the New Age, people would say energy. But older notions, it's life. Life is itself a component of existence that you have more or less of, and that is antithetical to death or disease or disorder. We piloted this in the summer of 2012, and the thing that I always wonder when I engage in these sorts of partnerships is that I have no idea when we draft them out and blueprint them if anyone can make this come together in a way that will cohere and that people will find benefit in. And so it was sort of a proof of concept more than anything else, sponsored by the Crystal Creek Lodge, the substance abuse treatment program, staffed by members of the Crazy Dog Society. And anytime you try something new and different in Indian country, people sit back. They don't want to be the ones to try it first. But there were 4 male clients who were intrepid enough to be interested in doing this, and was first offered for just a couple weeks to see what could come of this. Activities I broke down into traditional skills, cultural practices, and ritual participation. So traditional skills involved, first and foremost, on the very first day, setting up teepees. And, you can figure that out, I suppose, or you can get skilled at that. But then there was a double teepee where that was complicated. And it took hours and hours to do this. There were lodge paintings, something that Blackfeet in particular are known for, is certain designs on their lodges, berry picking, plant harvesting, hide tanning, collecting aniskim. Aniskim are fossilized shellfish, but for Blackfeet people, these are understood to be spirit helpers. And so you find a niskim and you put it in a bundle that you wear around your neck. And there's this very moving story that I won't recount in detail here, in which one of the clients was dreading going to court where he might be sentenced to jail for a long time for assaulting a police officer. And the day before, he had found a niskim, and he prayed to this niskim and very fervently asked that there be a good outcome. And then he went to court, and the cop didn't even show up, so the judge dismissed it. And this was an example of the kind of thing that people would point to as how an niskim can be helpful. Cultural practices included storytelling, designating your family ancestry, visiting the sacred site like Chief Mountain, which is the holiest place to Blackfeet people in the United States, decision-making, and ritual participation. So again, ritual ceremony was really the bedrock. The very first day after the teepees were set up, we had a pipe ceremony. The very next day, second day of the camp, we constructed a sweat lodge and did a sweat lodge ceremony. And there were other things that you can see here that people participated in too, but it just goes to show again that ceremony is really understood to be the core of this kind of endeavor. The ethos of the camp for the 2 weeks was quite interesting to me. First of all, it was sort of leisurely paced. Like you get up and go and everyone's ready to get up and go. I mean, that's sort of traditional life in some ways. And so instead of the usual inpatient experience these clients had of getting up at 8 in the morning, having your teeth brushed and your face washed by 8:15 so you can make breakfast in time not to get thrown out by 8:45, and your group started at 9, and you're behind locked doors all night long, this was totally different than that. And people commented on how much they preferred this kind of arrangement. Loosely scripted. So it's very important because, at one point we were expecting to go and kill a buffalo, for example, from the tribal herd. But the tribe relented on that, and so that wasn't possible. But there were other things they'd already mapped out, so we did something else instead. So there was always something to do every single day among the pool of things that the Crazy Dogs had put together. It was sensitively guided. This is really important. One of the Crazy Dog leaders kind of was in charge. He was a very gentle, very accessible, and humorous person. And I think this is crucial because in our communities, when it comes to sacred stuff, there are these hardliners. My colleague in Native Studies, Scott Lyons, calls them culture cops. They're like, it's my way or the highway, and I don't think that would work so well in this kind of setting. But because of the way Rick Round guided this, it really touched people. Was staff monitored? So these are clients in a treatment center, and there's legal implications and so on. So there were staff around, and there had to be certain kind of procedural stuff, but most of that was totally behind the scenes, and it didn't intrude very much at all into the everyday experience. Finally, it was community engaged. And so the Crazy Dogs were in this. We would go out in a given day, and there might be 20 people going out into the hills to harvest something. And I told you, 4 clients, right? But 20 people. Most people didn't know who was who. They didn't know who the clients were. They didn't know, and people would say things like, "Every Blackfeet person should be out here doing." They probably would benefit from this. It's not. Oh, why is it considered? Why is it exclusive to treatment, etc. So it broke down the boundary or the divider between an addictions client and a cultural organization designed to revitalize a religious experience. Very, very important. Some enduring impressions. Very memorable, inspiring. I think the sacred and socio-political significance of the Blackfeet program undertaking this kind of endeavor would be hard to overestimate. It was completely unrecognizable as a psychosocial treatment. There was no psychoeducation. There was no talk about your feelings. There was none of the stuff that you typically associate, not even the stuff that we saw in the earlier integration project, for example. It was about learning ancestral stuff and participating in ceremonies. So it did center traditional spirituality and religious experience and promoted a genuine sense of community and belonging. One key thing about this is, the Crazy Dogs are there. They're there before people go into treatment. They're there when people are after treatment. So there's a ready-made social circle that is not organized to help you because you're an alcoholic. It's designed to do something else that actually is incompatible with addiction or substance use in some ways. So this centering was really important because it really allowed for the harnessing of the Blackfeet past in ways that are consonant with, rather than alienated from, a vibrant, self-determined Blackfeet future. And I think this is why it was valued by clients. Not just 4 clients, so I could talk to them all throughout, and I interviewed them informally at the end. And of course, they're talking to me, and you can wonder to what degree they might have packaged their experience, but they, I think, seemed fairly honest. There were some criticisms, but mostly people found it really meaningful and talked about how they prefer it to the other kind of treatment, and they thought it could be really helpful for them. Now, does that mean that this works for addiction? Of course not. I mean, this is just a start of a beginning of something, and there are deep questions related to whether this can remedy addictions. Some of those questions are empirical. For example, can processes linking culture and recovery in Native communities be harnessed and deployed as treatment? It's one thing for people to have a problem, go into AA, and find that AA helps them. It's another thing to require someone to participate in AA and assume that it will help them. And this is sort of similar in that regard. We have to do scientific research around this to figure that out. Also, is cultural immersion enough to truly remedy substance abuse across a range of addiction severity? So it may be that you can restore purpose and identity and those kinds of things, but addiction has a way of hooking you into ways in which you sabotage your own behavior. And whether this is enough would be something that would require charting out people's trajectories for years. Because actually people aren't considered fully, stably abstinent or recovered until like 6 years after they've gone through treatment and tried to abstain, because it's a relapsing, recurring disorder, typically framed. There are also logistical questions. Can scientific evaluation of this kind of project overcome some inherent limitations, like small sample sizes, constraints on random assignment, etc.? These have to do with the scientific nature of evaluating cause and effect relationships between something like a treatment and some beneficial outcomes. And can development, implementation, evaluation of cultural treatment projects successfully compete for research funding? And certainly not at that pilot stage. Maybe there's a way, but maybe not. I mean, this is really local, right? This is a Blackfeet program. The Blackfeet program is not going to be taken in this same form, down the road to my reservation. My reservation will want to do something different, maybe. It might have similarities, but it's not going to be exactly that. So how do you scale up or demonstrate efforts when these programs are developed in such a way that they're meant to be relentlessly local? In terms of today, I guess it was interesting to me and meaningful and important to me that this treatment program for the sequential 2 summers continue to offer this program themselves. I wasn't involved the second summer, I couldn't be, and by the third summer, there were things where it was clear that they were going to be wrapping up their effort. But the fact that they used their own scarce resources to continue to offer this and to refine it or revise it in some ways was really important. And it raises this, I think, interesting question for someone like me who's a community clinical psychologist. What if there are irreducible trade-offs between development of community-driven post-colonial interventions, on the one hand, like the Blackfeet camp, and the design of portable, replicable, and scientifically evaluable interventions, on the other hand? What if, to make it local and meaningful, you eliminate it from being scientifically evaluated? What would then be the right thing to do? I'm not going to go too much into this one because I want to wrap up and leave time for exchange. But on the basis of this very local, very ground interventions, I started to think, how could you develop something in partnership with a Native community that might be a little more portable, that maybe you could start to implement in some ways across multiple communities? And so I began this research partnership with the Urban American Indian Health Clinic in Detroit. And they asked me, in fact, at one point, to help them figure out how can you incorporate indigenous traditional healing practices into the services they offer. They're a health clinic. They offer medical services. So how could you integrate traditional healing into that? So we began a multi-stage project that's taken more than 5 years at this point with different phases. First phase was consultation for like a year and a half, of focus groups with community members, of interviewing administrators, interviewing providers, and trying to figure out what are people's ideas about integrating traditional healing practices into services at the clinic. Then we began a period of program development once they gave us a mandate, because lo and behold, no solution emerged from all of those consultations. There were principles, there were ideas, but there wasn't a clear here's where to go or here's what to do. So the partners there had to come up with something, and what they commissioned us to do was basically to develop a spiritual socialization program for the urban American Indian community in Detroit. And so this phase of program development involved consulting with a local ceremony leader to start to learn the ins and outs of what are the principles and aspects of ceremonial practice that should be incorporated in a 12-week program designed to help urban American Indians learn about their traditional spirituality. So really, the signature innovation was to take something that happens kind of organically in tribal communities like reservations, but which urban Indian people often don't have access to, and therefore to make a curriculum, a structured curriculum that has a pedagogical role around these issues to teach people. I think of it as akin in some ways to like Catholic confirmation or something. It's like teaching you how to do stuff when that's totally foreign to how this is done typically. But that's what they were wanting us to do. And then to implement it, which we did. So it was a fantastic experience. 10 people went through it. We're analyzing their interviews still now, but people found remarkable meaning, again, in this program. It wasn't designed to remedy a particular diagnosis of any kind. It was meant to sort of be promoting of health, of coping, of social connection, of good things that would prevent bad things from befalling people. So in some sense, it wasn't designed to be a treatment for any particular problem. It was more along the lines of, because this is what we were commissioned to do, trying to be interested in kind of the health benefits that would accrue, including engaging people in the institution, the agency, more so than they might otherwise have been. So here's what I would want to leave you with tonight after talking with you for a while. Community mental health services for Indigenous and American Indian people are vexed by this post-colonial predicament. Lots of problems, but incongruent services that don't fit. That professional and American Indian therapeutic traditions diverge in substantial cultural ways. That there's no one-size-fits-all, that mental health professional work is itself a set of cultural orientations, dispositions, and assumptions, that those may not fit, and indeed Indian people typically say that they don't fit. But that there is a broad interest in reformulating services toward greater cultural commensurability. So this is true to some degree in the language of cultural competence, which is throughout healthcare and probably education and lots of other sectors now. But in general, that's something people understand, wanting to reformulate these things to be more culturally adaptive and culturally relevant. A compelling point of departure, therefore, in Native communities is the Indigenous claim that our culture is our treatment. People advocate this, they say this, so if we were to take that seriously, what can we do? That these culture as treatment projects can depart substantially from recognizable forms of psychosocial treatment. If you work with a community to develop something that they want, it doesn't necessarily look like treatment, even though they are developing it as therapeutically beneficial on the basis of traditions and approaches that have some resonance with Indigenous people today. And scientific evaluation of these kinds of projects remains a worthy but fraught endeavor. So I've written a lot about this and a bunch of other stuff, and it's all here if you want to look at more of it in writing, although it's scientific writing, so it may or may not be of interest to you. But in any case, I would love to hear your thoughts at this point for the time that we have left tonight. So thank you.